of sustainable forest management versus forest landscape restoration. As many of you know, and maybe some of you don't know, there's a persistent issue of fads in development work and in conservation and development work. And in the 1990s, sustainable forest management was what everyone was talking about, and there was funding for that, for projects that would address that all throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And this is a picture of some of the unsustainable management of forests in Gabon. And this then, just a second, so it's not in here. Yeah, so it was within that global context that we began coming up with the ideas that are important in adaptive collaborative management. This is a picture from Sumatra with one of the groups that we worked with collaboratively in the period in the early 2000s. But more recently, particularly in the last, say, 5 years, there's been this shift. Of course, I should mention that we didn't manage to manage forests sustainably so far. And as time has gone by, the forests have gotten more and more degraded. And so in recent years, there's been this emphasis on either forest restoration or forest landscape restoration. There's arguments about which of these should be used. Now, this is an example from the Olympic Peninsula in the US, where the Forest Service manages a lot of that land, and they have been replanting with timber species consistently at least since the 70s when I did research there. And they still are reforesting. So that reforestation is not part of the restoration fad, but it's surely influenced by it as well. And this is a picture I took off the web, so that's why it's a little fuzzy, I guess. But this is representative of this program called Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which is a US-based program. This is the one I want to compare with the adaptive collaborative management. This one started in 2010 and continues until the present. And I'm going to talk more about that in detail in a moment. These are just some books. The two on the side are ones that have come out of adaptive collaborative management, and there are others. And the ones in the middle are from this forest landscape restoration series of activities and projects around the US. Now, the ones from ACM tend to be in developing countries, and the ones from the collaboratives are in the US only. So I want to look at the similarities and differences, but I should explain, when I say similarities, I'm talking about the similarities in the conceptual framework, in the words used to describe both approaches. So the similarities are in implementation often very different, and so I will try to explain that as I go along. And then the differences are more fundamental differences. So I'll just go through the similarities and differences first, just to sort of orient you to what's coming. First of all, both approaches, and again, we're talking about collaboratives versus ACM, are specifically intended to involve collaboration with communities or with local people somehow. Both have been interested in something called future scenarios, so the idea of looking to the future and figuring out something that you want to be working toward. And so that was important for both. Some people call it visioning. With communities, we called it the star to guide you by. Then both are also interested in monitoring and social learning, really crucial elements. Adaptiveness as well, those are linked of course. Both kinds of approaches made use of third-party facilitation as well. So there was somebody who could help smooth over difficulties, take leadership from time to time, keep things moving along when they began to lag, that sort of thing. And then the last one to mention is not something that was mentioned in any of the, or at least certainly not in much of the literature about either approach, and that's the centrality of trust. But it is something that emerged as really crucial as people move forward in implementing both approaches. Differences. The stated purpose is quite different. The funding and the scale are hugely different. And the project timelines are also quite different. In the US, there's a huge amount of data available, and that was not the case in tropical countries. Where decisions were made differed enormously. And the question of whether or not there was any prior collaborative action. So did the people have a history of working together or not on these subjects? So as I said before, we're thinking of conceptual similarities, but differences in implementation. So if we turn to collaboration, in the legislation that that funded the collaboratives in the US, collaboration was explicitly stated. It's even in the title. But the way it has played out, at least in the material that I've read, is very much at the kind of mid-level, rather than as in ACM, which was very much at the community level. The collaboratives tended to have groups of institutions or organizations that were working together, and then they would have members of those organizations as participants, as collaborators in the work. And there wasn't very much attention to who they were collaborating with, but the few that I've seen where they did specify, they tended to be more older white men. And I'm suspicious that perhaps that was a common trend, but we don't really have that data. In ACM, there was a very explicit effort from the very beginning to be inclusive. As Louise mentioned, I've been interested in gender, but I've also been interested in age differences and ethnic differences and these different ways that people can be marginalized. And as the program leader for the version of ACM that I'm talking about, I was very insistent that we pay a lot of attention to that issue, and we did on all of our sites. The second one, this question of future scenarios. Wish I could get this out of my way. There we go. They both kinds of groups used future scenarios or some kind of visioning to help them decide about what sorts of activities they would take. But within the collaboratives, because of the very explicit emphasis on restoration within the funding source, all of the final situations that they were aiming for were very much closely focused on restoration. In ACM, on the other hand, we were working with C4, and C4 was interested in things that had to do with the forest and human well-being, about equally. And so in our version of collaboration and future scenarios, we left all the decision about what the future goal would be to the communities. So the only constraints were that it had to have something to do with the forest and or something to do with human well-being. So that's a pretty broad spectrum of things that people could pick to work on. And this picture here is from Tanzania, and it was some people who were making their own future scenarios by drawing pictures and then explaining what they were thinking of in those pictures. The third one is monitoring and social learning, and some people consider this really to be the heart and soul of adaptive collaborative management, and there's no question that it's a really crucial part. Within the collaboratives, one of the difficulties that has been reported in the literature was that the monitoring was extremely technical. That monitoring regarding restoration was extremely technical, and it tended to be carried out either by the Forest Service itself or by contractors who were experts in monitoring or something that needed to be monitored. And one of the results was that they had a greater difficulty moving from the social learning that was going on, the monitoring that was going on, to the action stage. So they would go ahead and do the monitoring, but very often what would happen was when it was time to change the action that was implied, the pre-existing plans were too rigid, and so they could only use that learning in some other context or at a much later date. So it didn't go directly from monitoring and social learning to action in the way that we were able to do in ACM. Now, of course, it's much easier to do that if you're dealing with a small community instead of a large area. And we also, I think, were able to pay more attention to local knowledge. which was quite important, of course, in tropical forests. And I argue that it's very important in US forests as well. And here's some women in Uganda who are monitoring a fish pond. This is a diagram that was very, very helpful to the teams in kind of keeping us on track in terms of the approach that we were considering. And I've already mentioned that there was a kind of future issue on the right end of this, this diagram that had already been chosen by the divisioning. But we would try to observe and analyze what is the local situation, plan according to what is needed for that future that they were looking for, do some sort of action that contributed to that, and then monitor it, reflect on that, and then if it needed to be changed, come up with a new action. If it was going fine, continue with the old action. And so we would do this in an iterative process, over and over in many cases. So adaptation, which is of course closely linked with monitoring and social learning in theory, I've already explained that it was really a problem in the U.S. Forest Service situation because of this was partly because the U.S. Forest Service is very big, very unwieldy. It's hamstrung in some ways by regulations that are designed to protect the forest and to protect, to make management more sustainable. But really the outcome is that it's quite unwieldy. And so trying to change something midstream, which of course you have to do if you're using this kind of iterative process, becomes much more difficult in that context. Whereas if you're working with communities, as ACM was, it's pretty easy. It's really very easy. You've got small groups of people, they're dealing with small land area in general, and they can just say, okay, well, I guess we'll do this a different way. And so it's nowhere near as hard as it is if you have a big area and a lot of people. And also, it may be, I'm not sure if this is true, but it may be that you have less conflict in the smaller groups than in the larger groups. And I'm sort of skeptical about that one. Okay, and then we were also, because we were able to directly adapt some kind of practices, we developed useful methods within a particular locale for how to do that. So that was helpful. Then the fifth one I wanted to talk about was this third-party facilitation. That was not written into the legislation for the collaboratives, I don't believe, but it evolved as being very necessary in both among the collaboratives and also with ACM. One of the differences, though, of course, which follows from what I've said before, is that with the collaboratives, the facilitation was much more at this intermediate level, you know, members of organizations or institutions, a kind of an intermediate level. And a lot of the facilitation went from that collaborating group upwards to the Forest Service. Within ACM, it was much more a matter of facilitating amongst small groups of individuals, often informal groups, at a very micro level. So most of the facilitation was more kind of horizontal, so within the community, and only a little bit went vertically to outside actors who may or may not have had, or may have had more power and prestige in the wider world. And this is a picture from Sumatra, just to show some of the conditions under which ACM was carried out. I'm sure Louise will be familiar with that kind of context. The last one is the centrality of trust. And again, this is another one that was not specified in either approach. In ACM, we talked somewhat about rapport, which is a very similar related kind of concept. But we didn't really talk about trust. And I think one of the reasons we didn't talk about trust was it's not popular. It was not at that time. It was not, it was sort of taboo to talk about these kind of emotional things, you know, like trust and respect. And I think the attitudes about that have changed somewhat in the forestry world. And so both ACM actors and collaboratives have recognized explicitly that trust is very important for making the process proceed smoothly. there were three different, I don't know the details of the collaboratives because I'm relying, of course, on literature mostly, although I had a few interviews with people. But within ACM, there were three kinds of trust issues that emerged. One of them was, in some communities, there was a terrible level of distrust among community members themselves. So there were factions, you know, that didn't agree with each other and wanted things done differently. Sometimes there was huge suspicion between the community and the Forest Service, for instance, or some NGO that had had a lot of action in that community. And then lastly, we had two kinds of teams in the ACM at CFOR. We had the administrative team, a team of people who had been developing the approach and were in charge of the people in the teams in the countries. And so each country had its own team, and then there was the central team. And so sometimes there was distrust between these groups, even though we were trying very hard to have a very kind of democratic approach. This fellow's in Gabon, and he's angry with an outsider who has been trying to rule how the community uses their forests. So that kind of covers the similarities that I've come across, or I'm going to switch here to the differences. Some of these are quite obvious. The purpose was explicitly different. Collaboratives were definitely and clearly focused on restoration, with a little bit of attention to livelihoods. Livelihoods were in the legislation, but it appears there's general agreement that most of the emphasis was on the ecological aspects. Within ACM, I was the program leader, and I'm an anthropologist, so I was, of course, going to be emphasizing human well-being as much as sustainable forest management. So I think our efforts tended to be sort of equal in terms of those two foci. But my own sense is that it doesn't make too much difference what the purpose is, actually. I think this kind of collaboration with communities can be useful for all sorts of different topics. A huge difference was the funding and the scale. The collaborative started in 2010 with $40 million from the government, and then they got 25 million more in 2011, totaling 23 collaboratives. And I should mention here, I'm talking about the collaboratives that were funded by the US government. But in recent years, there's, in the Pacific Northwest anyway, and I don't know about the rest of the world or of the US, but in the Pacific Northwest, there are 28 collaboratives altogether, and only, was it 3 or 4, a small number of them are actually funded by the US government. So the idea of the collaboratives has spread, and that's kind of exciting. But anyway, to return to the collaboratives that are funded by the US government, they each have to be 50,000 acres rather, or greater of public land. So the smallest they can possibly be is 50,000 acres. ACM, on the other hand, we never had any huge amount of funding. We begged $1 million there, and $1.5 million there, 100,000 over there, and we had a whole range of donors. I've got them listed here: Asian Development Bank, Department for International Development, this other one's from Switzerland, the Zurich one, EU, GTZ from Germany, International Food and Agricultural Development, ITTO, that's International Tropical Timber Organization, Swiss, USAID, and I'm sure there were others as well. That we just had to hunt around and get money for these different sites. We had 11 countries that we were working in, and the countries themselves had between 1 and 6 sites. Most of them had 2 to 4. But then they would each get, a typical amount would be about $50,000 for a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, and then they would either have to, that would be for the country, and then they would have to divide that among their sites. So we had a lot less money, and we were on a much smaller scale. Some of the places were informal forest management units, FMUs. Some were on lands that were defined as public, but actually were managed and considered to be owned by communities. And so there was very often a conflict about that issue in the sites where we worked. So it's a pretty different scale and amount of funding. this one, the project timelines, is another thing that was extremely very different between the two. The collaboratives were funded from the very beginning for 10 years, and then it was specified that they should continue monitoring what was happening for another 5. So they had a really good stretch of time in which to work, and they knew about it from the beginning. We could never find more than 4 years worth of funding for any of the sites, and a number of them were only 2 years. And before the 4 years ended, we would start looking for funding to continue, because we knew that we wanted to continue in almost all the sites. But there would always be a gap. We could never get the funding to come before the first funding had finished. And so, the momentum would dissipate. The people who were working on it would have to find other jobs because they couldn't not be employed for a year or whatever. And so this was a real disadvantage for the work that we did. Another difference is the availability of data. In the US, many of you know, we have data coming out our ears. But most of it is, especially if it has anything to do with people, it's anonymous, and it's usually, if it's available, widely available, it's quantitative data. And some of the things that we felt we needed in doing the collaborative work was data about specific people. We needed to know the ethnicity, the gender, the age, the religion, variable and different, it's different in different communities, what we needed to know. But it was not possible to use some of the data, if we had the data that you have in the US. We needed to know some of those details that are not really available, or they're hard to pull out of an anonymous data set. In ACM, we almost never had any data to speak of. There might be a census. Some NGO might have done a small survey. So occasionally there was some data available, but mostly we had to come up with our own. Yeah. Now this issue, the decision-making authority. In theory, the collaboratives, the collaborative groups make a lot of decisions. And that's how it's seen by the forestry people that I've worked with. They feel like the collaboratives are developing. But my own feeling, looking at it from the outside and looking at it from the kinds of decision-making that occurred in the villages, is that the Forest Service really kind of ran things. And there are, in some of the analyses that people have done of the collaboratives, there are quotations from people again and again, actually saying, yeah, well, it's the Forest Service that decides, or, this is the Forest Service's thing. And of course, the money is coming through the Forest Service, so there's that element as well. But I think it is true that compared to sort of standard practice for the Forest Service outside of the collaboratives, they are developing more decision-making ability than they're used to, or decision-making authority than they're used to doing. Within ACM, they pretty much had almost complete right to make their decisions about what they wanted to do, where they wanted to go, and all that sort of thing. And I would have a caveat though. Mostly what I'm talking about here is the first period from about 1998 to 2006. From 2006 to 2010, we did some experimenting with trying to do ACM at this kind of intermediate level in a number of countries, 5 countries in one project, and in Indonesia in another one. And there we ran into some of the kinds of problems that were reported for the collaboratives. In that whereas at the village level, that through communication and discussion and all that sort of thing, it was possible to come up with shared decisions. At this kind of mid-level range, there were people who had the authority to say, no, we're not going to do it that way, even if the group at large wanted to. And so that was, I think it's a lot more it maybe needs a different approach at the mid-level, at mid-level, which of course is what the collaboratives have done. So there certainly are good things about the way the collaboratives have done things. And so I'm not intending to be critical so much as just to compare and contrast the difference in approaches. And this is a Forest Service employee. Prior collaborative action is another one that this was kind of inevitable given the way the collaborative's funding worked. The government had said, we will give you this money to work on restoration, but you have to have already planned. So groups would plan their restoration work, and then they would submit a proposal to the US government for this collaborative money. And so they automatically then had some history of working together. In some cases, it was a long history. They'd done a lot of different projects together before the collaboratives. In others, it was newer. But in our case, many of the groups that we worked with in communities were newly developed. I mean, they might have come together because they were interested in beekeeping, or they came together because they were interested in making woodlots. Sometimes we worked with groups that had been formally created by the government in that country, but very often those were not really functioning groups. They were more groups in name than they were in terms of actually doing anything, like the forest management communities in Zimbabwe, for instance. At that time, at least where we were, they were pretty not very active. This is a group in Burkina Faso. So we were usually starting more or less from scratch, and the collaboratives were not. So I want to hear now, those are kind of an overview of the similarities and differences, but I want to now go back a little bit and think about which ones do and don't make a difference in terms of I should say here that my analysis is based on my own reading of the literature and understanding of what's happening. We don't have very many actual post-approach assessments, you know, to actually say this one definitely is better and that one is definitely better. But this is using my own judgment. So there were some activities or parts of approaches that were valued in both contexts by both collaboratives and ACM. The visioning was, everybody agreed that was vital. You really needed that to keep yourselves on track. The worm, or the collaboratives didn't have a picture like that, but they really had the same idea in terms of social learning, monitoring, and adaptation. The importance of excellent facilitation, and here I should mention this neutral in quotes. We were not really neutral because we wanted to make sure that management was equitable. And so in that sense, we were dealing with community groups that very often were not equitable. And so we were trying to come up with strategies that would allow them to go in the direction they wanted to go, but in a more equitable way. So it was more the perception that we were neutral. We weren't on the side of one faction or the other. We weren't for the Forest Service as opposed to the communities, or vice versa. That's the way in which we were neutral. But I do think that this difference between this kind of horizontal facilitation that ACM did is a little bit different from the more vertical one that the collaboratives were doing. And I think in the long run, the ACM should be more interested also in vertical facilitation, and the collaboratives should be more involved in horizontal facilitation. So that would be a recommendation, I guess. And then the last one I wanted to mention in terms of shared elements is this issue of trust, because over and over again that came up in both kinds of approaches, that if things were successful, they had to have been built on quite a bit of trust among the different participants. Some of the less relevant differences to my way of thinking is this whole question of purpose. I think you can do all kinds of, you can have all kinds of long-term goals and use these same kinds of collaborative approaches to reach them. The point is to learn from what you're doing, to not give up when you fail the first time, and to put what you've learned into practice. So the purpose to me doesn't make a lot of difference. The amount of funding. This is something that most people consider to be really crucial. And it would have been nice to have more money, of course. But we compared the communities that had a lot of money within ACM with those that didn't have very much, because as I mentioned, there was a pot of money for a country, and then it was divided between the sites. If there were 1 or 2, they got more. If there were 6, they got less. And so we looked at that across the 11 countries, and we didn't see any connection between the amount of funding and the success that they had in terms of this process. The issue of data availability, I've already mentioned some of the difficulties with the data that you could get in the US. There was lots of it, but I'm just looking at the time. There was lots of it, but it wasn't appropriate. It wasn't what was needed to move you forward in a kind of adaptive process. And with prior collaborative action, the same sort of thing. It was nice if you had it in some ways, but on the downside, if you had prior collaborative action, sometimes you had come up with rather top-down customs, or you had developed antagonisms within the group that were difficult to overcome. So there are certainly some advantages to starting fresh. And then this is the last slide. That is, I've tried to pull out the differences that I think really do make a difference. This question of scale, I think that we have to be looking at the intermediate scale with some different, not so much the approach needs to be different as the techniques we use to bring groups together. Because one of the issues is you really have to deal more clearly with power if you're working at that kind of mid-level. The duration of funding, to me, is one of the most critical things. I think, you know, the collaboratives have been able to institutionalize this approach in a lot of new places. I don't know how many in other parts of the country, but the fact that there were 28 that have popped up in the Pacific Northwest, and there's only a few that are actually funded by the government, that's a pretty serious positive kind of outcome for if you're in favor of collaborative work, which of course I am. The business of the locus of decision making. We found that having people in the communities be the ones who make the final decisions was really pretty critical, because if you're making decisions for them, then when you go away, probably they'll quit doing it. And if they're making their own decisions, the likelihood that it will be sustainable over the long haul is much higher in my mind. The direct links between monitoring and management, I think that's really important. In both of these cases, the decision making and the lack of links, of direct links between the learning and the action, were a source of frustration for the people who were involved in the collaboratives. And I think it was an advantage for ACM that that was more clearly within the community and more clearly leading to action. And these last two, they were extremely important in ACM. We felt that if you want something to be sustainable, you're going to have to make it more equitable. It's sort of a philosophical perspective we had, I guess, and I still agree with that. And I think that the U.S. Forest Service, the collaboratives, would benefit from much more attention to this issue, which also includes their getting access to local knowledge, which is not really part of the collaboratives, as far as I can tell. And then the last one is this issue of respect, and I think that it goes closely with trust. I mean, people tend to trust people who respect them. But the idea of having respect for the local knowledge, having respect for the wishes, for the direction that people want to go, so that they can have some say over the trajectory of change in their community. To me, these are really important elements that I felt we were very much able to do within ACM, and I would like to see more effectively integrated into the collaboratives. And with that, I think I'll stop so that we have some time to have questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Colfer, for an exciting presentation. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. I'll ask that you can raise your hand in the participant window, and I'll call you to ask your question. If you can make it as brief as possible, no more than 2 minutes, and then we'll try to handle 3 at a time if we can. So anybody with questions, I see Rewa Pankasla, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please go ahead and ask your question.
So I had a quick question, and it has a little bit to do what you have on your slide. If you could talk a little bit more about the ACM project in itself, in terms of what was the project, what were the aims, who were the organizations that sort of initiated it, and what was the community and your experience working on it, that would be really nice.
Great. Can we take another? Is anybody else with another question? I don't see one yet. Carol, you can go ahead and start answering that while I wait for you.
Okay. That's kind of a hard question to answer because, of course, each community chose different things to work on. Some of the examples were in Nepal. They were worried about hygiene, and one of the communities worked together to increase the number of toilets in their area, and succeeded by encouraging a certain amount of competition between the different hamlets. And in Malawi, they had beekeeping. They were interested in beekeeping, and let's see, what would be some other good examples? In Jambi, in Sumatra, this one that was quite more heavily involved in, they had a group of, they had 2 factions between the indigenous people and the in-migrants. They had some trans-migrants, they're called, from Java. And so there was antagonism between these 2 groups. And so the facilitator worked with members of both of those groups, women, to come up with an income generating project that was weaving forest fibers into baskets and then figuring out how to sell those and outside the village. Another one in that same community, they wanted to have rights to protect this one mountain that was nearby, or mountain hill. And so that was both men and women, but probably men were more involved in that one because it did involve a lot of wandering around in the rather dense tropical forest. Is that the kind of thing you're wondering about, or would you rather?
Yeah, that was what I was asking. Just like a quick follow-up, were all of these happening parallelly as a part of like a larger project that was being overseen by someone or something, or were these like different timelines, different times in your career? I think that is something that I'm not sure on.
I didn't get the last part, but I think I got the gist of it. The large project was the ACM project, which was coordinated from Bogor. And then each site had its own, each country had its own small group that was being responsive to what the communities wanted. So there was a huge amount of variation from one group to another. In one of the communities, in Cameroon, for instance, the team decided to start at the policy level and then sort of work. So they identified 6 policy topics, and then they went to communities where those were issues and followed up in that way. More often, people would go to the communities and then start at that level and decide what to do. The Cameroon was kind of an outlier, but it was sort of an interesting one. They had we gave them a lot of, not only did the communities have a lot of flexibility, but the teams also had a lot of flexibility about how they wanted to approach it, as long as they kind of fit in with the worm. It's a really critical sort of single thread that all of them had.
Carol, I'd like to just say something. This is Louise. It may not be clear to everyone that this was all coordinated by the Center for International Forestry Research, by C4. And so it's an unusual type of project for a CGIAR center to coordinate, especially when this thing first began. was very decentralized, and a tremendous amount of local control and local authority was given for this research agenda, I think we'd call it, because Carol was so committed to, you know, really letting local voices, you know, drive their particular project agendas. I'm not sure everyone really understands that.
It was definitely, at that time, it was a very much of a, the people I was working with at C4 in general felt it was very strange and that it was very risky. They were afraid that nothing would come of it, that it was too qualitative, that other people would not respect what was done. And so I had to defend it over and over and over again. We had later on, when we started working at this kind of mid-level, I was involved in other things. And so I was only involved as a, you know, at a sort of mid-level. I wasn't the leader of the project. And in one of them particularly, they simply could not let go of the control. You know, they started out with a plan, and then they kind of, because they were worried about their relations with the donor and the fear that the donor wouldn't understand that we were trying to be responsive to the community, they were not responsive to the community, and it didn't work very well at all.
Carol, I don't see any other hands up. I will use my privilege as a moderator to ask a final question. And since you've had a long, illustrious career in this space, I'm wondering to what extent the rise of social media and global awareness on environment has affected the way work is done on the ground and any effect on these particular models. I do recall when I was at the African Development Bank, anything that had to do with forestry and, you know, natural resource management was very sensitive because of the political potential for fallout if you don't do something right. You comment a little bit on how the rise of social media might have affected how things are done now compared to 30 years ago.
Well, I'm not really sure of the answer to that, because, well, this book that we're working on right now should give us some ideas about this, because I've gone back to the people who were involved in ACM in the 2000s and asked them, what have they done in the interim, using or not using, or deciding specifically not to use some elements of ACM as we envisioned it at the time. And so in another year, I should have a whole body of information, including stuff about that, I'm sure. But I've worked for a long time in East Kalimantan, and the people in this community, which was very remote, actually very remote until recently, it was in the middle of Borneo. Now they're all on Facebook. I communicate with them every day on Facebook. And, you know, it has all kinds of potential for really, you know, for allowing voices to be heard that were never heard before. So I see the value of it and the potential, but I don't know how it's actually, you know, I'm not involved right now in any of these projects, so I don't know what's actually happening with that regard. Maybe Louise does, or you.
That's maybe for another topic for another day, and see with that. For our time here, I'd like to actually ask everybody to join me in thanking our speaker today. If you don't mind unmuting yourself, we can give a round of applause to our speaker today. Thank you very much for your time.
And to you too.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.